Have you ever imagined that the innocent words of a 5-year-old child could rescue a soul standing at the very edge of collapse? On that particular night, inside a quiet urgent care clinic tucked into a corner of New York City that most people passed without looking up, a struggling single father named Benjamin Sinclair stood completely still, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and heartbreak, as his daughter Riley pointed her small finger at the most powerful and beautiful woman in the room and announced to everyone present, "Daddy, I want her to be my mom." But what stunned the room was not the child's request. It was the secret hidden beneath the woman's tears, the secret behind a velvet dress and a diamond pendant and a face that had appeared on 3 magazine covers in the past 18 months, and behind the reason a woman like that would be sitting alone in a clinic waiting room at 2 in the morning, with her hands pressed so tight. The sound of a distant ambulance siren dissolved into the wind that pressed itself through every crack in the glass. Outside, the city was buried under a coat of white. Snow had been falling since 9 o'clock that evening, soft and relentless, covering the sidewalks and the fire escapes and the iron benches that no one sat on at this hour. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees since sundown. Inside the urgent care clinic on the corner of a street that mostly existed as a through route between places people actually wanted to be, the fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that made the silence heavier rather than lighter. Benjamin Sinclair sat in the far corner of the waiting room, with his elbows braced on his knees and his face buried in both hands. He was 29 years old, but the hollows beneath his eyes and the particular set of his shoulders told a different story, the story of someone who had been carrying a weight far longer than his years could comfortably account for. His coat was clean but worn at the collar, the stitching at the left cuff beginning to separate in a way he had been meaning to repair for 2 weeks. His boots had been resoled at least twice. He was not, by any simple measure, a man who had given up. But he was a man who had learned, slowly and at significant cost, that giving everything you have sometimes still leaves you standing in a waiting room at 2 in the morning wondering how you got here. 3 years ago, his wife had packed 2 suitcases and walked out of the apartment on a Tuesday afternoon with a man who drove a car Benjamin could not have afforded even in the best year he ever had. She had not looked back. She had left behind a half-finished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, a daughter not yet 2 years old sleeping in a second-hand crib, and every architectural drawing he had ever brought home to complete after hours, the evidence of a future he had believed in so completely that he had never imagined it failing to arrive. She had taken everything else. Since then, Benjamin's world had contracted to the size of a 3-room apartment in a building with a slow elevator and a superintendent who responded to maintenance requests approximately never. It had contracted to the size of a little girl with dark eyes and an uncanny ability to locate the center of any situation and walk straight toward it. Riley, 5 years old, was currently sitting on her father's knee with her left arm wrapped in a temporary bandage the intake nurse had applied at the front desk. She had fallen down the last 4 steps of their building stairwell earlier that evening, slipping on a patch of wet tile near the base landing that Benjamin had reported to building management twice in the previous month and once the month before that. She had not cried when it happened. She had looked up at her father from the floor with those wide, unhurried eyes of hers and said, with complete sincerity, "It's okay, Daddy. I just bent my wing a little." He had pressed his forehead to hers and stayed there long enough that she had patted his cheek and asked whether he was the one who was hurt. She was not wrong to ask. Across the waiting room, separated from father and daughter by a row of gray-blue plastic chairs, and the particular silence that settles between strangers sharing a difficult hour, sat a woman who could not have appeared more profoundly out of place. Amelia Hartwell was 27 years old. Her company managed a portfolio that most financial analysts described using numbers that required pausing before you said them aloud. She had walked into rooms full of men twice her age and watched them rearrange their posture in response to her presence. She had negotiated contracts in 3 languages and won a lawsuit that 2 of the most expensive attorneys in the state had told her was unwinnable. She had, in every room she had ever occupied professionally, been exactly what she needed to be. Composed, precise, entirely in control of what she allowed other people to see. Tonight she was sitting in a plastic chair beneath a flickering light in an urgent care clinic, still wearing the black velvet dress she had put on for a contract signing gala that had started 7 hours earlier. The neckline plunged in a deep V that revealed the sharp line of her collarbone and the faint glitter of a diamond pendant that had caught the light in every photograph taken of her at the event. Her heels were still on. Her hair was still pinned up, though several strands had come loose around her face. Her hands were clasped in her lap so tightly that the knuckles had gone entirely white. She was crying without making a sound. The tears moved down her face slowly, one after another, catching the fluorescent light before they dropped onto the expensive velvet of her dress and disappeared into the dark fabric, leaving nothing visible behind. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and the specific stillness of a place that has witnessed too many nights identical to this one. The clock above the intake desk moved its second hand with the mechanical indifference of clocks that exist only to mark how slowly time can pass. Somewhere behind a closed door at the end of the corridor, a television murmured at a volume too low to make out the words. Riley had been sitting quietly on her father's knee for nearly 20 minutes, which for her represented a considerable act of discipline. She watched the woman across the room the way children watch things they have already decided are important. Directly, without apology or self-consciousness, with a quality of attention that most adults have traded away in exchange for the appearance of tact. She watched the tears. She watched the hands. She watched the way the woman's shoulders rose and fell with a slow, deliberate rhythm that looked less like peace and more like someone rehearsing it. Then, without a word to her father, Riley climbed down from his knee. Benjamin moved immediately. Riley. She had already covered half the distance. She stopped in front of the woman and stood looking up at her, the small bandaged arm held carefully against her side, the dark eyes direct and unhurried, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Excuse me," Riley said, in the clear, unhurried voice she used for things she considered important. "Did you break your wing too?" Amelia raised her head. The question had reached her in a way that the antiseptic smell and the fluorescent light and the murmuring television had not. She looked at the child, at the bandaged arm and the dark eyes and the expression on that small face that held no pity and no performance. Before Benjamin could cross the room, Riley turned back to look at her father. Her expression had shifted into something brighter, something with the quality of recognition in it. "Daddy," she said, loudly enough for the intake nurse to look up, loudly enough for the sound to reach every corner of the small room. "Look at her. She looks like the mom in my drawing. The one with the long hair." She turned back to the woman and then back to her father without a trace of hesitation. "Daddy, I want her to be my mom." "You should marry her." The words dropped into the silence of the waiting room and stayed there. Benjamin stopped moving. He was aware, with a physical clarity, of the intake nurse looking up, of the clock still marking its indifferent seconds, of the television behind the door. He was aware of the heat rising in his face. And beneath the embarrassment, moving through it like a current beneath surface water, was something else. The recognition of how long his daughter had been carrying a longing that she had never had the words for, and the quiet devastation of hearing her finally find them in a room that was not ready for them. He crossed the room and took Riley's good hand in both of his. "Riley," he said quietly, "you don't say that to someone you don't know. Tell the lady you're sorry." He looked at Amelia and found that he could not complete the apology he had started. "I'm so sorry," he managed. She's had a long night." "She doesn't usually," he expected the withdrawal. He knew what it looked like, the slight elevation of the chin, the careful composure that communicates, without cruelty, that the intrusion has been noted and will not be engaged. He had seen it performed in elevators and lobbies, and on the sidewalk outside buildings where decisions were made about the kind of life you got to live. Amelia did none of those things. She looked at Benjamin, at the worn coat collar and the tired eyes, and the careful way he held his daughter's hand even in the middle of apologizing for her, and she felt something move in her chest that she had not expected at this hour, in this room, on this particular night. He was not performing anything. He was simply there, fully and without armor, the way people only manage to be when the cost of pretending has exceeded what they can afford to pay. "Don't apologize," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges, the roughness of something that has been held in. She didn't say anything wrong. She looked at Riley, and something in her expression moved toward the territory of a smile without quite arriving. I really am a little broken tonight. Riley studied her with the gravity of someone receiving a report and taking it seriously. That's okay, she said. My daddy fixes broken things. He fixed our toaster twice. And the pipe under the sink. Benjamin let out a breath that came from somewhere he hadn't known was holding it. A sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something it would have taken considerably longer to name. Amelia looked at him again, and this time the look held for a moment longer. There was a recognition between them, not the recognition of people who have previously met, but the quieter kind, the kind that comes from seeing someone and understanding without a word said that they have been carrying something heavy for longer than they have let on. I'm Amelia, she said. Benjamin, he said. And this is Riley, who apparently has strong opinions about strangers' personal lives. Riley, wholly unrepentant, stepped sideways and sat down in the chair next to Amelia's as though the matter had been thoroughly resolved. Amelia looked at the child settling into the chair beside her, the small, bandaged arm, the absolute confidence, the complete absence of self-consciousness, and felt something ease in her chest. Not much. Just enough to breathe at a slightly different depth than she had been breathing for the past 4 hours. I like her, Amelia said quietly. Everyone does, said Benjamin, pulling the adjacent chair out and sitting down. It's her father she hasn't quite managed to convince that everything is going to be all right. They sat without speaking for a little while. Riley occupied herself by inventorying the room. The poster on the wall, the water cooler in the corner, the small fish tank near the reception desk, whose inhabitants she declared were probably lonely and in need of names. Amelia watched her, and then looked down at her own hands. I was supposed to be celebrating tonight, she said. She wasn't sure afterward why she said it, whether it was the hour, or the light, or the particular exhaustion of the evening, or something in the uncomplicated presence of this man and this child that made concealment feel more costly than honesty. Whatever the reason, the sentence was out before she had decided to say it. We signed a contract tonight, she continued. The kind that takes 2 years to negotiate and closes a deal that most people in the industry told me was never going to happen. She paused. I was at the gala. We were on the 3rd course. Benjamin nodded slowly. That sounds like it should feel good. It did, she said. For about 40 minutes. She was quiet for a moment. Then my phone rang. She looked at her hands. I had a procedure last week. Something that was supposed to be a routine follow-up, a complication from a loss I had 2 months ago. The texture of her voice had changed, gone quieter and deeper, the way water changes quality when the ground beneath it drops away. Tonight, during the 3rd course of the gala dinner, the doctor called to tell me that it's possible I will not be able to. She stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Benjamin was quiet. He had learned, in the years since his wife left, and he had begun to understand what it meant to carry loss in the absence of anyone who wanted to hear about it, that the most respectful thing you could offer someone in a moment of honest grief was simply to remain present without flinching. He remained. I wore this dress, Amelia said after a moment, because I needed to walk into that room and have them see that I had everything under control. I needed them to look at me and see exactly what I intended. She looked down at the dark velvet, at the diamond catching even the thin fluorescent light. It worked. It always works. She lifted her eyes, but beneath all of this, she said, there is nothing but an empty heart. The words stayed in the silence between them, true and unhurried. Benjamin did not rush to fill the silence with reassurance or contradiction. He let her words remain what they were, said aloud, perhaps for the first time, to a room and a person who were not asking for anything in return. I wasn't always the person they see in those rooms either, he said after a while. Amelia turned to look at him. I had a firm, he said. Small, 3 employees, 1 client base that I'd spent 4 years building, and the beginning of an adaptive housing project I was convinced was going to be the most interesting thing this city had seen attempted in 30 years. He smiled, not at the memory exactly, but at the distance between the person who had believed that so completely and the person sitting in this particular chair. When my wife left, the lead client followed. Then, the employees. Then the lease on the office. He looked at Riley, who had graduated from naming the fish to delivering a brief speech to them on the subject of patience. I kept the firm registered for another 6 months because I couldn't let it go. Riley was the one who finally said, "Daddy, you should start over." "Beginnings are better anyway." Amelia stared at him. She was 2. 2.5, Benjamin said. "She's always been slightly ahead." Amelia looked at the child, at the small profile tilted toward the fish tank, the bandaged arm held carefully to the side, and the expression on her face moved past the approximation of a smile and arrived at the real thing. It was small and unperformed, and it changed her face so entirely that it might have belonged to a different person. "I was 11 when my parents told me we were losing the house," she said. "We moved 4 times in the next 3 years. I swore to myself, the way children swear things, with absolute conviction and no real understanding of what the swearing eventually costs, that no one would ever have that kind of power over my life again. That I would be the one who held the numbers, who understood the systems, who couldn't be caught off guard." She paused. "I built an entire life around that promise. And now?" Benjamin asked. "And now I am sitting in an urgent care clinic at 2 in the morning, in a dress that costs more than most people pay in rent," she said, crying in front of a stranger and his daughter. There was something wry in her voice, but softer than wry, something that had moved past bitterness into the territory of recognition. "The numbers, it turns out, don't cover everything." Benjamin nodded. He looked at his own hands, the calluses from the repair work he'd taken on to fill the income gaps, the permanent ink stain on the side of his right index finger, because he still drew, still drafted, still spread plans across the kitchen table after Riley was asleep, and believed in something he hadn't yet found a way to build it. "The thing I thought was the worst investment I ever made," he said, "gave me the only thing I genuinely cannot live without." He looked at Riley, who had now apparently concluded her address to the fish and was sitting very quietly, watching both of them with an expression of considerable satisfaction. "I don't know what the next version of things looks like, but I stopped being afraid of not knowing." Amelia looked at his hands, then at his face. "How?" she asked. Quietly, the way you ask a question when you actually want the answer. "I don't," he said. "Most days I just do the next thing, and trust that the shape of it will make sense eventually." "Riley helps." The nurse at the reception desk called Riley's name. Benjamin stood and reached for his daughter's hand, but Riley had already slid down from her chair and was standing directly in front of Amelia, looking at her with the same unhurried directness she had brought to every moment of the past half hour. "Don't cry any more," Riley said. "Okay." Amelia's throat moved. "I'll try," she said. "Good." Riley considered for a moment with the gravity of someone who has given the matter appropriate thought. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her uninjured arm around Amelia's neck. It was not a long embrace. It was not performed or calculated. It was the simple and complete commitment that small children bring to the act of comfort, the total absence of inventory, the giving without condition or expectation. Riley pressed her cheek against Amelia's and held on for a moment, and then stepped back and took her father's hand as though nothing further required discussion. But what the embrace had done was already done. It had reached past the velvet dress and the diamond pendant and every year of careful construction, and touched something that had not been touched in a very long time. Something that existed beneath all of the titles and the cover features, and the conference rooms. Something that had been waiting, with the patience of things that have learned not to ask, for exactly this. For a contact that wanted nothing from it. For a warmth that required nothing in return. Amelia pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her eyes had filled. Benjamin looked at her over his daughter's head, and in that look was something that required no translation. The quiet acknowledgement that something real had just happened in a room that had not expected to contain it. "We'll be right back," he said softly. The nurse led Riley through the door at the end of the corridor, and Benjamin followed, pausing at the threshold to look back once. Amelia sat very still in the blue-gray chair. The tears moved freely now, and she did not attempt to stop them. She was not, in this moment, the woman in the photographs. She was not the voice that had closed the contract this evening, or the name on the document still warm from the signing. She was simply a person at the end of an extraordinarily difficult day, sitting under a flickering light, feeling the ghost of a small arm around her neck and understanding, with a clarity that had not been available to her an hour ago, that what she had taken such precise and exhausting care to construct around herself was not protection. It was distance. And distance, she was beginning to understand at 2:15 in the morning, under a fluorescent light in a waiting room, on a street she had never previously had reason to visit, was not the same thing as safety. She reached up and unpinned her hair, let it fall. She sat with her hands open in her lap, and for the first time since the call came during the third course of the gala dinner, she stopped trying to breathe like someone who was not afraid. She breathed like someone who was afraid, and had decided to stay in the room anyway. When Benjamin returned with Riley, her arm confirmed to be a mild sprain, now wrapped in a proper bandage, and supported by a small sling, the color of a summer sky. Amelia had dried her face and straightened in her chair. But it was a different kind of straightening from any she had performed before. It was not the posture of someone preparing to be observed. It was the posture of someone who had decided to continue, for no audience at all. Riley went immediately to show Amelia the sling. The doctor said, "I'm like a superhero who used all her power at once and has to wait for it to come back," she announced, extending the arm for inspection with considerable pride. "He said I can draw with my other hand while I heal. I'm going to draw the fish. I hope Gerald and Steve make an appearance," Amelia said. Riley stared at her. "You remembered their names. I remember everything that matters," Amelia said. And the way she said it, not the words themselves, but the quality of attention underneath them, suggested that she meant it in a way that extended considerably beyond the fish near the reception desk. Benjamin sat down. The distance between them had not disappeared. He was clear-eyed enough to understand that one shared hour did not dismantle the years and the circumstances and the real difference in the positions they occupied in the world. But it was a different quality of distance now. Something closer to the distance between two people who have stepped back slightly in order to see each other more clearly. He was aware that she was beautiful. He had been aware of that from the moment he looked up from his hands and saw her across the room. But the beauty that registered now was a different kind. Then it had been the beauty of a composed and lit photograph. Now it was the beauty of a person in the middle of something genuinely difficult, still present, still choosing to engage, still capable of remembering the names of imaginary fish. He looked at the diamond pendant against the velvet and thought about what she had said, about the numbers, and the distance and the empty space inside the structure she had built with such precision over so many years. He thought about his own drawings still stacked in the closet of the spare room, and about the architectural truth he had always known, that a structure which has never been tested can look from the outside exactly like one that has. The clock above the reception desk read 5 minutes past 3 in the morning. Riley had fallen asleep against her father's side, her good hand curled loosely beneath her chin, the sling rising and falling with each slow breath. She looked, as she always looked in sleep, like someone who had made thorough peace with the world and had registered no outstanding complaints. Amelia looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into the small evening bag she had carried to the gala, designed for nothing practical, which had been entirely the point, and found what she was looking for. She removed a pen. A substantial one, the kind that has real weight and costs more than a pen has any reasonable business costing, because some habits form before they become choices. She reached across and picked up the printed instruction sheet from the pharmacy bag beside Benjamin's chair, Riley's aftercare directions for the sprain, 12-point type. She uncapped the pen. In the blank space at the bottom of the sheet, she wrote a number. She did not write her name. She did not write a title or a company. Just 10 digits, in a handwriting that was smaller and more careful than people familiar only with her signatures might have expected. She held the paper out to Benjamin. He looked at it, then at her. "That's my personal number," she said. "Not the office line, not my assistant, mine." She held his gaze without looking away. "If you ever want to talk about beginnings, or about what adaptive housing design looks like when it actually gets built, or about what it means to decide you're not going to be afraid of the next version of things, A pause, small and precise. Or if Riley wants to tell someone about Gerald and Steve. He took the paper. Their fingers did not touch. The distance between them was still there, and both of them understood that respecting it was not retreat. It was the recognition that some things need time and the proper light to become what they are. "And if you ever need someone who fixes things," Benjamin said, "I should mention that my rates are extremely reasonable, and I have very good references from a fish tank and a toaster." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not the smile from the magazine covers. It was entirely better. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. She stood. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, the gesture of someone returning to herself, or perhaps arriving at a version of herself she had not previously had occasion to introduce to the world. She gathered her bag. She looked at Riley one more time, the quiet face, the rising and falling sling, the hand open and unclenched beside her cheek. "She's going to be extraordinary," Amelia said. "She already is," said Benjamin. Amelia nodded, the nod of someone who has received confirmation of a thing they suspected and needed to hear from someone who knew for certain. Then she turned and walked toward the door and the night that waited on the other side of it. Outside, the snow had stopped. The city was silent in the specific way it manages silence only in the last hour before dawn. A held breath between the night that is ending and the day that has not yet begun. The sidewalks were white and entirely unmarked. The streetlights threw soft orange circles onto the undisturbed snow. The temperature had not changed, but the air had a different quality now, the quality of something finished. Amelia stood on the pavement for a moment before she called her driver. She looked up at the sky, which had shifted from black to the color of the inside of a pearl, not yet light, but no longer fully dark. Somewhere 3 blocks north, a garbage truck made its slow and necessary way through the empty streets. Somewhere closer, a single pigeon shifted on a ledge above the clinic entrance. She had walked into this night carrying the weight of a phone call that had reorganized the architecture of everything she had believed her future contained. She had sat at a gala table and smiled across the white linen, while the final numbers on the contract were reviewed one last time, and she had excused herself to the restroom, and stood at the sink and told herself, as she had told herself through every version of this kind of moment, that she had everything under control. That the structure she had built would hold. That the next step was already mapped, and the one after that as well. She was not certain, standing here now in the cold at 3 a.m. with her hair loose and a 10-digit number folded inside an evening bag, and the ghost of a small arm still present around her neck, that any of that was still true in the way she had previously meant it. But she found that she was not afraid of what that meant in the way she had been 4 hours ago. What she felt instead, beneath the exhaustion and the grief and the particular cold of the city after snowfall, was something she had not been able to name in a long time. Something small and provisional and not performing anything for anyone. It was not happiness exactly. It was something smaller and more durable than happiness. It was the faint but genuine sense that the next version of things had not yet been written. That the empty space she had described to a stranger in a waiting room was not the conclusion of a story, but the beginning of a room in which something new might, given time and in right conditions, begin to take its shape. She pulled her coat closed. She called her driver and stood watching the snow and did not fill the silence with planning. She let it simply be silence. And silence, it turned out, was not the same thing as emptiness. Inside the clinic, Benjamin sat with his sleeping daughter and held the folded paper without opening it. He already knew what was written there. He held it the way you hold something whose weight exceeds its physical dimensions, carefully, without clenching, aware that some things become less themselves the harder you grip. He thought about the year before Riley was born, when he had stood at the edge of a construction site in the lower Manhattan at 6 a.m. and watched the first steel beams being lifted into position for a building he had helped design. He had felt, watching it, that irreplaceable satisfaction of seeing something that had existed only as lines on paper begin to find its form in the world. He had thought then that this was what he was meant to do. Not just to design things, but to give the invisible a form that other people could inhabit, could move through, could call home. He had not felt the edge of that feeling in a long time. He felt it now. He looked at Riley, at the peace on her sleeping face, at the small hand uncurled beside her cheek. She had crossed a waiting room without hesitation, and spoken to a stranger and offered her arm around a neck and asked for nothing in return. She had done what she always did, moved toward the thing that needed to be moved toward, without stopping to consult the fear first. He thought she was the most courageous person he had ever known. He thought that perhaps what the next version of things required was not a complete plan, but a direction. Not a finished blueprint, but a first line on paper, the beginning from which everything else could be drawn. He tucked the folded paper carefully into the inner pocket of his coat, close to the center of things. He put his arm around his daughter's shoulders and held her with the lightness that the most precious things require. Firmly enough to know she was there, gently enough to let her breathe. Outside, the city was beginning its return to itself. The first light of morning was still an hour away, but the dark had changed its quality. It was the kind of dark that already knows it is nearly finished. Some debts were still outstanding. Some doors remained closed. Some questions would not find their answers before the sun came up. Benjamin knew this clearly, and it did not frighten him. The folded paper was in his pocket. Riley was warm against his side. The snow had stopped. And in a city of millions of strangers passing through one another's lives without pausing to look, two people who had arrived in the same waiting room on the worst night of their respective years had found, without looking for it? That was not nothing. That was, in the precise and careful accounting of the heart, almost everything.